in our department since it was formed and on the campus a lot longer than that. Gary actually is a native Marylander and did his undergraduate master's degree here at the University of Maryland, and then went off to my alma mater also, down at Texas A&M University, where I believe you worked, was it with Dr. Brown?
Yes.
Down there in the Department of Crop or Soil and Crop Sciences. I think that was it. Is that right?
Yeah.
At the time we were there?
That's correct.
And so anyway, Gary sells himself as I've heard him on numerous occasions describe himself as a dirty water engineer.
Perfect.
And has obviously been involved in a lot of those sorts of things, have impacts for what goes on in the Chesapeake Bay Watershed and the interface between the agricultural sector and the Chesapeake Bay it's a critical link. And so we're very fortunate today to hear Gary as he talks about the Chesapeake Bay program, and there's nobody around better to do it. So Gary, welcome, and I'll hand it over to you. And I'm gonna, let's see, have we started yeah, Stephanie's already started the recording, so we're good to go.
So I have to be careful what I say. Okay. I'm going to talk a little bit about the Chesapeake Bay, the EPA Chesapeake Bay program, and the focus of the talk is the agriculture and non-point source program support. That particular support has been in place for a lot longer than I've been involved. There's a person from our department that is responsible for most of what went on there. So the successes I'm going to talk about are due to Frank Cole. I'm merely the reporter. When we look at this, we're going to kind of go through the Bay, the Chesapeake Bay program history, and then the Chesapeake Bay Agricultural Support Program itself, and talk about a little bit of what goes on in there. So the Chesapeake Bay Watershed, if you're not familiar with it, is a fairly interesting watershed. It extends from New York to Middle Virginia, just south of Petersburg. About 90% of the Bay residents live within a half a mile of flowing water. Think about where you live and how far is it to the nearest creek or blue line stream of some sort. I happen to live across the road from the Middle Patuxent River. So my flowing stream is going straight into the bay. It's 64,000 square miles. Think about how many people can live in that. There's 17 million citizens living in this watershed, and they're all within a half a mile of flowing water. That tells me if I screw up, it's going to be in the water really, really fast. The bay itself is only 4,200 square miles. So we got this great big 64,000 square mile collector system. And it all flows into this itty bitty bathtub. And the bay is a lot like a bathtub. It's not very deep. Its average depth is 21 feet. It has some deep spots in it. There's one deep spot called the Hole that is pretty much within sight of the Bay Bridge. Depending on how you measure it, it's about 174 feet deep. But most of the bay is just a shallow little thing with 21 feet of depth. About 200 miles long, stretching from Havre de Grace in Maryland to Virginia Beach in Virginia. The bay and its tidal tribs, all of the rivers that flow into it, have 11,600 miles of shoreline, which is more than the entire West Coast shoreline. So there is a lot of interface between the land and the water. We look at chemicals that flow into the bay, and this is the chemical nitrogen that flows from Maryland into the bay, broken down by contributing sectors. Agriculture sector, which we're all very familiar with, is responsible for about 38% of the nitrogen, the urban sector about 17%. Septics are responsible for about 6%. Point sources are 29%. I almost always get a question, what's a point source? It's a euphemism. A point source, wastewater treatment plant. That's specifically what those are. And then we have down at the bottom here these other contributors. Forest, mixed open. Forest is obvious, mixed open is not as clear, but the mixed, why did it do that? Okay, and the mixed open is not a well-defined entity, but it's also small, so we don't worry about it too much. The chart on the left is the exact same chart I just had up. I'm just spinning it. If I take the urban sector and the point source sector, I can put those together and I call them urban life. And then if I chuck the septic tank, the other, the forest, the mixed open together, we call that other, because those could be in urban sectors or rural sectors. And we look at that and we see that urban life is responsible for about 46% of the nitrogen in the bay, and agriculture is about 38%. So the next time someone tells you that agriculture is responsible for the most nitrogen in the bay, take that with a grain of salt. It all depends on how you divide it up. The Chesapeake Bay program, I haven't told you this yet, but it's the EPA Chesapeake Bay program. We have 9 EPA regions that subdivide the nation into some areas that each has their own office. Well, the Chesapeake Bay program comes under Region 3, which is housed in Philadelphia. But the Chesapeake Bay program office is semi-autonomous. They report to Region 3, but there's not really a huge tight tie there. So my work with the Chesapeake Bay program is pretty much tied to just the Annapolis office. The program has grown. In the 70s, there was a 5-year study that looked at the bay and saw all kinds of changes in the resources in the bay, wildlife and aquatic life. And in 1970s, how long is that? That must be what, 50 years? Excess nutrient pollution was identified as the reason for the bay's decline. In '83, the original Chesapeake Bay Agreement. There's been a lot of Chesapeake Bay Agreements since then, but at that point it was signed by the governors of Maryland, Pennsylvania, Virginia, the mayor of DC, EPA's administrator at the time, the chair of the Chesapeake Bay Commission, and it was a pledge, 1-page document that said, we're going to clean up the bay. And that's about all it was. And it established the Chesapeake Bay program office here in Annapolis. Well, I'm not in Annapolis, but that's where I think of it. The Chesapeake Bay Agreement in '87 set the first numeric goals. Now let's see, that's 33 years ago. And it was goals for nitrogen and phosphorus. In '92, the partners agreed to attack nutrients at the source. That's the tributaries. That's upstream in the Bay Rivers. Remember, it's a collector system. It's dendritic, and it gets all this stuff from as far north as Cooperstown, New York. The Baseball Hall of Fame is the start of the Bay Watershed. In 2000, the headwater states, so-called, Delaware, New York, and West Virginia, joined the efforts. This agreement was a little more detailed. It set a restoration vision and a strategy, again with goals. What's a goal? Well, clean water is a goal, but it's not very specific. And so even in 2000, 20 years ago, we're still dealing with non-specific things. And then in 2010, this thing called a TMDL was established by EPA. Now, don't think of that as something new. The TMDLs were established in the Clean Water Act of 1972, federal legislation. And it became a federal, that everyone calls, pollution diet. And it set numeric limits on the amount of nutrients and sediment that can enter to the bay. In 2014, the Chesapeake Bay Program Partnership put those TMDLs into goals of the Chesapeake Bay, and each state was allocated a certain amount of nutrient reduction that they had to achieve to meet the goals. Then these things called watershed implementation plans showed up, WIPs. that spell out detailed specific steps each jurisdiction will take. Now, jurisdiction is a general word, and the idea was that each state would set its own. Well, what that meant was that each local government had the job passed off to them. So whips are actually written at the county level and spells out what this county is going to get in the way of nutrient reductions. And of course, those reductions all have to add up to the required reductions from the state. And well, what happens if they don't meet those? Well, it means that EPA has the tools to sue the states. It's never happened, but it's a possibility. In 2019, the Chesapeake Bay continued its commitment, and the time deadline of 2025 was set to restore the bay. Now, we're not going to restore anything, but we might reclaim it and we might improve it considerably. So you've just run through a history of the Chesapeake Bay program, and you were also introduced to something else that comes along. It's called Bay Speak. People that live this stuff talk in alphanumeric shorthand, and we call it Bay Speak. You can tell somebody that works in the Chesapeake Bay program after about one sentence. And they use things like TMDL, which is defined here, CBPO, the Chesapeake Bay Program Office, which is in Annapolis. The partnership is like the Ohio State University. It's capitalized and the is part of the name. The partnership represents 19 federal agencies, 40 state agencies, programs in Delaware, Maryland, New York, Pennsylvania, Virginia, West Virginia, and DC. About 1,800 local governments. And there's this thing called the Local Government Advisory Committee that's part of the Chesapeake Bay program. And there's more than 20 academic institutions, of which University of Maryland College Park is just one. They're on a committee called Scientific Technical Advisory Committee, but we all just say STAC. And there's some other non-governmental and NGOs. NGO is another shorthand, means non-governmental organization. That term's a little bit more recognized. If you want facts about the Chesapeake Bay Program Office, about the Chesapeake Bay, there's a website down here at the bottom. I think you're able to see my cursor. If someone can see my cursor at the bottom, please confirm it verbally.
Yes.
Thank you. You can find out so much about the Chesapeake Bay and the Chesapeake Bay program at this particular address. And if you just go down to chesapeakebay.net, you'll get the whole program office there. More Bay Speak. I said WIPs. Those are the watershed implementation plans and their roadmaps. They're developed by the local government, and they're in the 6 watershed states and DC. Figure out how they'll meet those demands of the TMDL established by EPA. We have something called a GIT. That's called a Goal Implementation Team. There's at least a half a dozen different GITs in the Chesapeake Bay program. The one I'm concerned about is the Water Quality GIT, the Water Quality Goal Implementation Team. They sit over top of, in the Bay hierarchy, the agricultural support program. Remember, this is a talk about the ag support programs, and I'm getting there. So the water quality GIT sits above them in the hierarchy, and so we essentially report to them. I'm not even going to worry about the SAIB. It's only used inside the Bay office, I think. CAST is something that's a Chesapeake assessment scenario tool. It's used all over the watershed. It's a computer program to test scenarios. For example, if you write a WHIP, is it going to get you the nutrient reduction you need? You know, if you write up a WHIP as a piece of local government and you haven't run the CAST, you probably ought to say, yes, CAST says we're going to get where we need to go. It means that your plan looks reasonable. And then there's the model, again, capital V. The Chesapeake Bay Water Quality Model, which in writing is abbreviated CBWQM. It's actually 2 numerical models. There's a hydrology model, and then there's a constituent fate and transport model. And it produces input to CAST. Well, the water quality model takes a long time to run. CAST runs in instants. And the data comes from I'm going to say numerous sources, and we may talk about some of those. Finally, we made it to where we're going, the Chesapeake Bay Program Ag Support Effort. This program has been in existence for quite a while. The US EPA Chesapeake Bay Program has given us money since 1999 to fund multiple non-point source specialist positions. The grants is a 5-year competitive grant. This past year, it was 6 years. I'm not sure why. It's led by Agner faculty. In our case, it's led by ENST faculty. And the Chesapeake Bay Program Office is where the specialists are based. So I have people that work for me, and they work in Annapolis, and you seldom, if ever, see them. People that you may or may not know. Some of the graduate students that have, shall we say, tenure here probably went to school with at least one of these people. So it's also a source for jobs for graduate students. Someday you're going to get out of here. Professional staff members are located at the CBPO and lead the agricultural programmatic implementation. I don't lead it. I'm just the bureaucrat that keeps things going. They're the ones that lead it. There is a non-point source evaluation and data analysis effort. In a normal proposal, we'd call this an objective, but we don't in EPA implementation grants. There is a coordination of the Chesapeake Bay Agricultural Work Group. And a third effort is to expand the application of best management practices. And this is just a long way to say the same thing, to make sure that the new science, new technology gets put on the ground as soon as possible, as soon as it's been confirmed that it's a good practice for our region. What is the funding? It's money straight from EPA to ENST. It's a grant, so of course there's overhead on it. We pay 26% overhead, not the, 52% we pay now, because everybody is housed off campus at EPA. And so off campus has a different rate, which is 26%, or maybe it's 27 or 28% today. But when we wrote the grant 5 years ago, it was 26. The staff are UMD employees. That is sometimes very good for them. On occasionally, it's not as good, but for the most part, it's good for them. The grant was $3.9 million between 2015 and 21, so it's a 6-year grant this year, or about $650,000 a year to run this program, to pay 3 people, to pay the expenses, the benefits, to pay a lot of travel. There's a lot of travel involved in these jobs. So you can imagine that these jobs have kind of morphed a little bit in the last 9 months. So what do they do in these jobs? What are the activities? Well, first, the activities are the name that we would normally call objectives, but in EPA's implementation grants, they're called activities. In broad strokes, we put the latest and best science into solutions that can be put on the ground, specific to the ag sector, specific to improving water quality. Those are the keys to what makes an activity. So our team brings together science, extension, and research principles to move forward to get the TMDL goals for NP and sediment implemented. It provides a unique opportunity to collaborate with a dynamic, and you might even put that in quote, group of federal, state, and local government representatives, as well as scientists, conservationists, farmers, and industry representatives. Think about that people there, and you might guess that perhaps there's more than one agenda when these people get together. Some of these people are not always happy with others of these people. So we have 3 activities that our grant does. We do agricultural programmatic implementation support. We help the Chesapeake Bay Program Partnership, or the partnership, implement agricultural programs. That means that we work with people in ag to help them put together things that'll help the Bay program. The second activity is a non-point source pollution program implementation and evaluation support. Has kind of turned into a policy point at this time, and we help people with the whips as they begin to put them together. The third activity is the Ag Work Group. This is a group that meets monthly, and we do things that have to do with individual best management practices. We're going to talk more about each of these. When we write the grant, we get Ag Programmatic Implementation, Activity 1. Well, if you've written a grant, you'll probably see that you write objectives. Then you write tasks underneath them, and we call those objectives. Don't know why this terminology came about. It was before me. But Activity 1 then has Objective 1. In this case, it's to expand the partnership access to an understanding of agriculture, conservation implementation, things that the jurisdiction wants done, and what they mean to ag production and to conservation. There's a phrase that gets tossed around. When we talk about a BMP, we sometimes ask, is the juice worth the squeeze? In other words, is the change in conservation worth the amount of effort from agricultural production to get that change? And so these are a listing of Activity 1 and the objectives within them. Activity 2 and Activity 3 also have objectives within them. I'm sure not going to take you through time and time all of the things that are objectives in this, but if you read through some of these, you get the idea that we work to improve other people's understandings of agriculture and agriculture's understanding of what it takes to improve the bay. So who are these people and who are their clientele? We use a word in extension called clientele. That's the people that we work with, the people that we serve. So our senior agricultural advisor is Mark Dubin. Mark graduated from the University of Maryland College of Agriculture. He started out in the IAA program, and I don't know if he graduated in agronomy or in plant science, but it was some time ago when it may have been the same place. Some clientele of Mark are industry groups like grain producers, fertilizer vendors, regulatory agencies at the local, state, and federal levels. Mark develops really practical partnerships. In other words, he helps people shake hands and agree to work together between land-grant universities and industry groups. Because quite frankly, the industry groups are familiar with, I'm from the government and I'm here to help you. And that's what they think of land-grant universities. But the result is, working together, we can get research projects from these partnerships. Some of the issues and topics that Mark's handling over here on your right, he facilitates discussion among feds and local agencies, conservation districts, which is part of the state government system, universities, agribusiness, and corporate sectors to look at sustainable and cost-effective ag production systems, maybe new, maybe just not used much, that benefit water quality and address concerns related to ag BMPs. So he tries to get a balance with the various players who don't always talk to each other and get them to do projects that will help them work together and will benefit water. He is quite the communicator. The second person we have is our non-point source policy analyst. Her name is Ruth Casilli. Ruth is involved with, right now, a lot in Pennsylvania. She's got colleagues from the EPA, from the Chesapeake Bay Program Office. We all have clientele that are part of the EPA Chesapeake Bay Program Office. She has colleagues from the USGS, the Pennsylvania Department of Environmental Protection, the ICPRB, and the Susquehanna River Basin, among others. But she helps these people do things like develop technical presentation and tools that help the whips. They describe water quality trends within local rivers, uses casts to develop some what-if scenarios for the WHIPs, shares the land use, the BMPs, and the nutrient data that the Chesapeake Bay program is able to get, sometimes has to pay for, and allows localities to design detailed BMP implementation scenarios, in other words, WHIPs. The Ag Work Group coordinator, Ag Work Group is abbreviated AGWG, is Loretta Collins. You may know Loretta. She was a graduate student here and got her master's in soils. She worked in the nutrient management office for a while, and then she ran into this job. Some of her clientele, I'm not going to talk much about the SAIB, that's terminology the Chesapeake Bay Program Office uses there and nowhere else. But they're the people that are above and throughout the group we work for. She works with the modeling team, with contractors. And let me take a sideline here. The Chesapeake Bay Program Office houses about 70 people. There's roughly 70 doing work there. Somewhere between 13 and 17 of them are EPA employees. The rest are contractors. We in ENST are a contractor to the Chesapeake Bay Program Office. So there's a small staff of EPA, and contractors represent the people that are doing things. She deals with ag reps within the Chesapeake Bay Program Office. She deals with the Ag Work Group leadership, and the chair of the Ag Work Group is sort of dense and needs help about once a month in figuring out where they're going. She works with the Ag Work Group at large members, with the Urban Stormwater Work Group, the Land Use Work Group, the Watershed Technical Work Group, and the Water Quality GIT and the leadership in it. The chair of the Ag Work Group is elected every 2 years, and I started in February. The issues and topics that Loretta has to handle are intricacies of the model, policies at the EPA Region 3 office, issues common to the Chesapeake Bay Program Office and to NGOs, to soil and water conservation districts, state agencies, scientists, USGS and land grant universities, any issue that's salient to the Ag Work Group. And some non-point source issues are overlapping with ag. I can think of right now one particular non-point source issue, and that's biosolids, which when you think about it, well, that comes out of a wastewater treatment plant. What's that have to do with ag? Those biosolids are put down on ag lands, so it overlaps with ag. There are some people whose job is to project land use, and that affects things in agriculture, particularly when the model runs up through the year 2055. The land use changes have to be projected, and so it's fairly important to agriculture that those land projections are not way out. Okay, how do we get all this work done? 3 things are key to what we do. It's education, research, and advocacy. We'll talk more about each one. Education is to speak to agricultural concerns, learn the intricacies of the issues, turn them into a narrative that people can understand. We have to talk across silos. Within our department, we often talk about the silos that we have. Those are called research, teaching, and extension. And talking across those silos within a department is pretty easy, although we do have to make an effort to do it. Talking across the silos at the Chesapeake Bay program takes a little bit more effort. You have to deal with people who don't normally see each other, may never have shaken hands before, although we don't do that today. They are ag industry, state agencies, local government, university people, getting them to talk to each other and learn about other people's issues and what they deal with. We have to educate the partnership itself. Remember, that's a big group of people. Overcome the complexity of models. That's the Chesapeake Bay Water Quality Model and CAST. And those are what's used to measure progress. So when the EPA says, have you met your TMDLs? They don't go out and measure the water. They look at the model results, because most of the results are to be projected into the future. Are you going to come in at 2025 with what you need, for instance? And then manage the disjointed communication across the partnership to keep the communications flowing. So that's part of the education challenge and what we do. Here's a little bit more, and I'm not going to talk a whole lot about this, but the last bullet here is that we represent the University of Maryland and the Chesapeake Bay program at technical meetings. We present papers, we present findings, we present science, because there's a social science and a physical science that are associated with improving water quality in the Chesapeake Bay, not in a little plot, but in the bay itself. Now let's look at some of the regional research we do. We look at projects that have land grant universities working to improve the representation of ag production in the Mid-Atlantic regions. That's a generalization. I'll show some specifics in a minute. But we want to answer applied questions, regionally important research questions. And so we'll see some examples. First example is a commercial poultry production project. It's going on now and for the next year or two, depending on how COVID affects us, because this one is very travel sensitive. But to document changes in poultry production and the changes in those effects on nutrient generation, which of course is disposed of or utilized in the Bay watershed. It includes genetics, feed rations, additives, facility management practices. If anyone's familiar with broiler production, you know that we clean the broiler houses out periodically. Well, some of the companies that run these clean out a barn completely once a year. Some of them would like to go 5 years because the shavings are expensive. And so those are management practices that we look at. And we update the Chesapeake Bay program's TMDL Phase 6 watershed modeling tools. What that really means is we change the input data. And in this case, the University of Maryland and Virginia Tech are partnering along with US EPA and NRCS, Department of Conservation and Rec, DENREC, West Virginia Department of Ag, and US Poultry and Egg Association. The bottom line, this project gets money from industry. A second, we look at commercial swine production projects. This one is predominantly in Pennsylvania because that's where the swine production is in the watershed. And it sounds a lot like the one we just talked about. What are the changes over time? What effect has that had on nutrient generation and management? And how does that compare to nationally published data? Because that's what we use in the model right now, is just take the data literally out of a book. Again, there's industry money coming in on this. This is a layer production project. It does a lot of the same things. Egg-laying chickens and broiler chickens are drastically different in how they're raised, and their manure is handled drastically differently. There's a big difference in these two. And we don't look at layers too much. So this is a much needed look at what the layer does. We have layers in Cecil County, in fact, where there will be 3 farms that together have about 1.5 million birds in them laying eggs every day. It's a lot of birds in a small area. The last one is a commercial fertilizer research project, trying to figure out, is the data that we're getting right now as good as or better than the fertilizer sales data if we take it straight from state reg agencies and take it on an annual basis instead of purchasing that data from this group called AAPFCO. If you want to know about this group some more, Dr. Tour is on this call and he'll answer those questions. Is this data that they give us, that they sell us actually, is it better to get it from the state agencies? It's a very practical question, but it needs some land truthing, some ground truthing, and some research to answer those questions. Finally, the last part of the methodology to get what we want is, are we advocates? We are advocates for science and advocates for the partnership processes. We try very hard not to advocate for broiler production, dairy production, any part or all of agriculture. We want to be advocating for science. We facilitate to make sure that people are communicating, which is probably the one word that's most important in what we do. We speak in terms of science, but we have to acknowledge all the agendas that come to the table. If Delaware, for example, is not doing a particular practice, they don't really want to have to do that practice. And so they come to the table with that agenda. If Delaware, for example, is doing a practice, they want to make sure that the BMP process to get those data into the model, give them credit for what they're doing. I'm not picking on Delaware. It's just that the Delaware rep is a guy named Chris Brosh, who is familiar to some of you, and he's a graduate of our department also. So I feel a little more comfortable using him as an example. Is there any slant? The goals are to improve transparency, understanding of how the Chesapeake Bay Partnership impacts ag stakeholders, to guide the ag work group to think thoughtfully about the BMP implementation that's going on and what the value is of it. And then to look at the scientific community to ensure that those BMPs are rigorously evaluated scientifically regarding their impacts. These things are called expert panels. We'll collect panels of maybe 5 to 7 individuals from all across the nation that are experts in a specific topic. There's one panel going on right now that's about to finish called the Animal Mortality Panel. And they're experts in management of animal mortalities, not just poultry. So they're going to give us some input on our BMPs. Bless their souls, they are volunteers. We don't pay for anything except their expenses. So part of our grant pays for the expense of flying them in a few times a year to meet as a group and work out some things. Now, we're going to be Zooming a whole lot more than we used to. So what are some results of what we've done? I hate to cover up a beautiful sunset, but this is called result number 1. It's just number 1 because it's in our mid-year report. We produce 2 reports a year. And this one coordinated multiple project development efforts and implementation meetings with research and extension faculty of Virginia Tech, obtained assistance and support, obtained money, identified, applied for, and secured the sources of funding, developed a budget, and got EPA to sign off on it. So it basically developed a proposal. This is result number 7. Provide technical assistance to Penn State University's Environment and Natural Resources Institute to help develop and implement new farm conservation practices in the southern counties, Adams, Franklin, Lancaster, and York counties. Those counties are kind of given the bad name of the reason that the Conowingo Reservoir is polluted. Assistance is provided to them for co-development of conservation practice surveys so that we can get better information and try to put the Phase 6 Chesapeake Bay Watershed model in a place to use better data that this would develop. Result 49, represented the University of Maryland at a meeting and gave a professional paper. 63, initiated, proposed, and was awarded funding from STAC to put on a workshop that would gather information from people to provide concrete recommendations to the partnership on how to improve implementation within the agricultural sector. In other words, get people together that have done this and find out how to get the ag sector to do something in particular. At this point, I've given you an overview of what the Ag Work Group Ag Support Team does. These are members of our department that you probably didn't know unless you have to approve their travel. At this point, Marty, I can take questions. To help with a little bit of this, I hate to cover up that boat, but down there at the bottom right is my email, so you can get in touch with me if you want to. And I'll take questions, Marty.
Great, very good. Well, thanks very much, Gary.
My pleasure.
As our normal procedure, if you have questions, just to kind of be able to manage and keep track of those a little bit better, if you sort of channel those into the chat room, and then we'll make sure we bring those up. So does the Chesapeake Bay program have any input, Gary, on the infamous Chesapeake Bay report card? Or or do you put out something that's sort of comparable to that? Do you have?
They do actually use some data that we provide. We provide the data to the Chesapeake Bay program, and then the Chesapeake Bay Foundation, who writes the report card, goes to the Chesapeake Bay program office to get those data. And somehow that data ends up at VIMS, which is Virginia Institute of Marine Science. That's
VIMS.
William and Mary, I believe. That's where VIMS is located, I believe. Yeah. I was trying to remember what place down there in the South it was. And then that's where the report card is put together through VIMS. And then Will Baker goes and gets it and gets on stage and talks about it.
Okay.
So it's not a straightforward process. It's convoluted, but yeah, we're involved.
Okay. All right, good. So here's a question. Are there any metrics on how much reduction in nutrient loading can be attributed to the work that's being sort of done by the Chesapeake Bay program?
The Chesapeake Bay program will take credit for absolutely all of the reductions. That's not always the case. Some Maryland legislation resulted in some really significant reductions, but in some form it was because the Bay program prodded that change in legislation. There was a change in law for commercial fertilizer to where phosphorus content would be 0. So when you go buy a bag of phosphorus to put on your turf, or a bag of fertilizer, there's no phosphorus in it. Now there is phosphorus in garden fertilizer, but the turf fertilizer that is the most sold has 0 in it, and that's part of Maryland legislation. And the fertilizer industry doesn't produce fertilizer for Maryland. It produces fertilizer for the Mid-Atlantic region. And so all the states in the Mid-Atlantic region get 0 phosphorus. So yeah, that had a big impact.
Okay.
But to say that X% of phosphorus was reduced due to Chesapeake Bay Program Office would be a stretch. We could say that the Maryland legislation had, I believe it was 3%, by reducing the phosphorus in Maryland, 3% of the phosphorus that had to be reduced in the entire watershed was reduced. If we just applied that law to Maryland.
Okay.
So
here's another question. This one probably could be a huge one, so don't try to answer the world with this, but Dave Rupert is asking you to comment a little bit about strengths and weaknesses of the Chesapeake Bay model.
No.
Okay.
I know that model pretty well, and I don't know whether he means the hydrologic model or the water quality model or the cast. It's such a convoluted question that I could sit down and talk for about 8 hours with him.
Yeah, I knew it would have a big answer. So no is about as short an answer as I could expect or consider. So, So here's a question Jonathan Case is asking about Maryland Department of Environment's role in the Chesapeake Bay program. Are they involved?
They are most definitely involved. We have these things called CAFOs, Confined Animal Feeding Operations. And we also have MAFOs, Maryland Animal Feeding Operations. Those are regulated by MDE. So they are involved. We work with MDE on evaluating how those regulations affect Chesapeake Bay water quality. So some of their numbers that they will use probably came from the program office.
Okay. Andy is asking about this big grant that comes into ENST, and he's wondering, does anybody else compete for this?
It is a competitive grant. So our main competitor is usually Virginia Tech. It's once every 5 or 6 years, so it's not something that comes around frequently, but it is a competitive grant, yes. EPA puts out an RFA, and then we respond to the RFA.
All right, and here's another question from Dave Rupert. If I quite get all this, but it says, is the Bay model only used by EPA to evaluate WIPs, or do state agencies like MDA or industry consult the Bay model when considering policy?
Almost everybody he mentioned consults the Bay model by using CAST. The Bay model itself is run to get input data to CAST. And CAST is a scenario builder where you can go in and specify on this small section of land, here's the land use, here's the BMPs. It'll run the model and give you a 50-year production or projection of what the impacts of this are going to be. And you can change it with time if you so desire, and what the impacts on what Bay water quality are. So they do use it, yes. It's more than just the water EPA water program, yes. It's used by all the states.
Okay.
In fact, counties use it.
So another question, do the local agencies that are tasked with enforcing WIP and the TMDLs have any authoritative power or any kind of reward system to help get agriculture to comply with measures to reduce the nutrient loading?
I wish that was a straightforward question.
Sounds like somebody asking from in the know, so I don't know.
Yeah. The enforcement power lies at the federal level with the EPA through the Clean Water Act. The TMDLs are enforceable. That means that they can sue the states. It's then the state's job to get the localities to respond. So the responsibility is transferred in different methods from fed to state and then state to local, because I don't know exactly what the carrot and the stick is for state to local, but I know that the local responds really, really rapidly to the state. I think there must be money involved.
Jonathan was asking about who the individuals that you mentioned. Are they actually ENST faculty members? Are they, where do they fit within the University of Maryland system?
They are ENST PTK faculty.
Okay, great.
They're in our specialist line.
All right. Loretta is offering a comment here. She says there's actually 2 different public reports that measure the Bay progress. You probably know this, Gary, but for the rest of us, that says there's the Chesapeake Bay report card that comes from UMCES and the State of the Bay report from the Chesapeake Bay Foundation, which is not to be, she says, confused with the Chesapeake Bay program.
Or the Chesapeake Bay Commission.
So,
yeah.
Okay, great. Well, I think those are the ones that have come in. Oh, yeah. So anyway, really interesting, helpful presentation, Gary. I think hopefully now we've got a little better picture of the way these things kind of fit together and all the parts that are going into helping to clean up the Bay, and the way that a number of our ENST folks are directly involved in that. So thank you once again for a great presentation.
And again, Loretta, thank you.
And all thanks to all the Chesapeake Bay program folks from around the state and the region that are helping to make this happen.
Very good.
All righty.
Thank you and good night.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Yep. See
Bye-bye.
y'all later.